Greetings. This is Dan Gardner, and on behalf of Mercado, I'd like to welcome you to Module 1 of our import training program entitled An Integrated Approach to Importing into the United States. This is the first of several modules, all of which add up to approximately 60 hours of material. So if you take all of the modules, we're going to be spending some time together. This first one is especially important because it lays the groundwork for all of our subsequent work and a philosophy based on the idea of supply chain management, global supply chain management, driven by an integrated approach, the integration of functional business activities, both internally to an organization and externally. Without any further ado, let's jump into Module 1. In every module that we do, we're going to start with a layout of that module's objectives. You'll see the objectives at the beginning of each class and at the end as well, so you can judge if, through the material presented, we indeed achieved our objectives. What are we going to do here in Module 1? First, speaking of that groundwork we mentioned a moment ago, establish the strategic foundation of the Master Import Specialist program. The totality of all the modules we put together, the Master Import Specialist program. Second, we're going to present and analyze different inbound supply chain models. We're not going to limit our analysis of importing into the United States to a retailer or a manufacturer that imports raw materials for production. We're going to look at multiple models, and a model is really just the way a company conducts their business. We'll see lots and lots of different ones that illustrate these foundational points. 3, we'll introduce the concept of integrated logistics to U.S. import supply chain management. Let's begin by saying that supply chain management and logistics are not the same thing. Logistics, a very important business discipline, but a subset of supply chain management. But this concept of integrating not only supply chain functions, but logistics functions as well, is a powerful one to speak of in this very first module. And then finally, a theme we will see from beginning to end is the importance of linking import supply chain performance, how we execute, to financial outcomes. There has to be a clear link between our objectives for supply chain, the strategies we use, certainly the tactics that we put in place, and what the financial outcomes are on an income statement, a balance sheet, and probably most important, the cash flow statement. Let's see how our agenda lines up with those objectives. In many modules, depending on the topic at hand, we oftentimes start out with definitions of key terms. We don't like to make assumptions about people's level of exposure or understanding of importing into the United States, so we're oftentimes going to lay a foundation with some key terms and concepts. Number 2, let's say right now that as part of this program, we're going to repeat ourselves quite frequently and offer no apologies for doing so. There are just certain things, certain concepts that have to be driven home constantly. Bullet number 2 here is an example of that. Managing import supply chains, 4 primary objectives. Clearly, there can be more than 4 objectives for most import supply chain models. We're talking about 4 that matter to every model. We'll analyze different supply chain models. We mentioned a moment ago the difference between an importer of raw materials that go into a manufacturing environment and a retailer. Those are the different models, many others too, that we'll look at. We'll talk about the financial goals of supply chain and get into an introduction to integrated logistics. What do you say we have at it? We'd really like to begin here with a few words on supply chain execution from a gentleman named Louis V. Gerstner Jr., who was actually CEO of IBM from 1993 to 2002, staging one of the greatest comebacks in the history of American business, and the experience he expressed through a book called Who Says Elephants Can't Dance? Excellent book. We have no commercial relationship with Louis Gerstner or his book. It's just a great publication and very salient for what we're trying to talk about here. So let's see what he had to say. In 2002, when this book came out, all of the great companies in the world out-execute their competitors day in and day out in the marketplace, in their manufacturing plants, in their logistics, in their inventory turns, in just about everything they do. Rarely do great companies have a proprietary position that insulates them from the constant hand-to-hand combat of competition. And in the end, that's what supply chain execution is all about. The ability to compete out on the field of play, metaphorically speaking, for global business. Let's review a couple of points here. Out-execute in the first sentence. The tactical ability to do things better in a supply chain than the competition. Look at the reference to specific supply chain activities. Manufacturing. Certainly logistics. Inventory turns, which is an essential component of supply chain. This one sentence really says a lot about the importance of the ability to compete in the marketplace. And all of that, apart from having great innovative products that people actually are willing to pay a price for, is what matters most. The ability to execute. That's one of the underlying themes of this entire import program. One thing we try to avoid in our training is just rote learning, where we're reading from slides and suggesting that people memorize concepts and such. That's not what we're all about. However, there are certain definitions out there that there's no way around actually studying them, learning them, and ultimately understanding and being able to apply them out in the marketplace. One of those slides is the one we have right here. A definition of supply chain management provided by the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals. We took the liberty of putting in red some of the more important concepts to avoid reading word for word the entire paragraph. Let's see what CSCMP has to say about supply chain management. First, supply chain encompasses the planning and management of all activities involved in sourcing, procurement, conversion, etc. Let's stop here for a second. Why is the word planning italicized and put in red? Because in terms of tactical supply chain execution, which we can define as a one-year period, planning means forecasting. Coming up with a forecast for the sale of multiple products that we might offer in the marketplace, and how we build our supply chain initially around a forecast. That is why planning is highlighted in red and italicized. The definition goes on to talk about functional activities. Of course, sourcing and procurement. We have 6 hours on sourcing alone. So these individual business functions are certainly important. Conversion, that's just a fancy term for manufacturing and logistics management activities. Moving on to the next highlighted phrase, channel partners. These are the third parties that we in supply chain, that we in the U.S. import business are compelled to work with. We can't do everything ourselves. Offshore manufacturers that we outsource work to. The vendors that we use ourselves to buy raw materials for in our own manufacturing environment. Banks that finance operations. Cargo insurance companies, most definitely third-party logistics service providers. That's who we're talking about there. How we integrate and collaborate with those partners, because we cannot execute without them. Perhaps the biggest highlight here is the next one. Supply chain being the integration of supply and demand management. We've all heard this. Anyone that's taken an Economics 101 class, you've heard the term, out in the marketplace, we have to match supply with demand. As overly simplistic as it sounds, that is exactly what global supply chain management comes down to. And history has shown that the easier or more simplistic a concept seems, the harder it is to do out in the marketplace. Matching supply with demand in a global environment is the essence of supply chain management, very difficult to do. And in that tactical one-year period, it does start with planning, which can be defined initially as forecasting. We'll move on and incorporate logistics into the conversation. We already said previously that logistics is a legitimate business discipline. The physical movement and or storage of goods across a supply chain. But logistics and supply chain are not the same thing. We will elaborate on that point later on. But this is a good, solid definition, helps us to establish the groundwork for that tactical one-year period of supply chain execution, and starts to broaden our frame of reference about what global supply chain management really is. This is a slide that we're going to see lots of, not only in this module, but in subsequent modules as well. The visual we use quite a bit. The title of the slide might change depending on the topic at hand, but the visual, it's general enough that it allows us to describe an overall view of global supply chain management. But depending on the topic at hand, it also helps us to drill down into specific areas. As it relates to our current discussion, we're talking about that overarching theme, the integration of import supply chains, which really comes down to linking buy-side and sell-side activities. We'll use that terminology a lot, buy-side and sell-side. We're talking about the acquisition of goods on the buy-side, maybe raw materials from overseas to go into our own manufacturing environment. Maybe it's finished goods that we outsource manufacturing. For now, that doesn't necessarily matter. We're talking about the buy side, working with vendors, working with manufacturers, into the sell side environment, sometimes referred to as distribution management. Regardless of model, what we're trying to convey here is that the entire exercise, supply chain planning, starts with a customer-centric approach and being able to receive as quickly as possible demand signals from those customers, actual purchases, actual orders from customers that we can use in conjunction with the forecast to begin and continue the process of matching supply with demand. And how do we convert demand signals from customers, whether they're walking into a store, buying online, placing an order with a salesperson, or all of the above? How do we convert those demand signals into actionable requirements up and down the supply chain, all the way up to vendors overseas, into a manufacturing environment, and back out to customers? We will see this slide quite a bit. But the theme is the integration, both internally at a company and externally with these channel partners that we spoke of just a moment ago. This is that slide that we spoke of a moment ago, saying that there'd be a lot of repetition. And we will acknowledge that there are more than 4 objectives of managing inbound supply chains. That's not the point here. What we are saying is that regardless of your model, there are 4 transcendental objectives that have to be in place all the time. This is what they are. Regardless of business model, all import activities should focus on either influencing or directly impacting 4 areas. We'll talk about this over and over again. First, maximize sales opportunities. What does that mean? Having the right product in the right place at the right time. All of those things are about supply chain execution. Putting our organization in the best position possible through both buy-side and sell-side activities to maximize the amount of goods that we can sell at the price we're hoping to sell them for. Second, control landed costs. We will go over this topic incessantly. We will define the difference between unit and landed cost. But the idea of controlling landed costs from a financial perspective is hugely important. Not only the unit price that we pay at the door of a vendor in, let's say, the Netherlands, but transportation, inland freight at origin, international ocean or air freight, customs duties into the United States, all of the things that add up to landed cost. We as an organization have to focus on this as one of our 4 key points. 3, reduce and stabilize cumulative lead times. Very quickly, cumulative lead time is defined by APICS, the American Production and Inventory Control Society, whom we think very highly of, as the amount of time that transpires from the moment a need is recognized until that need is fulfilled. In a tactical supply chain environment, that 12-month period, cumulative lead times comes down to from the moment I place a PO on a vendor until I get the goods into my customer's hands. Needless to say, based on that definition, not only the reduction, but the stabilization of cumulative lead times is very, very important. And then the essential component of supply chain that we spoke of a moment ago when we talked about matching supply with demand is to optimize inventory investment. What does that mean? What it really means is spend as little money as possible on inventory while being able to put product in the hands of every single customer that wants to buy our product. Very, very difficult to do. We want to spend as little as possible and sell as much as possible. Inventory investment goes to the heart and soul of supply chain. We'll talk lots and lots about that in subsequent slides, sections, and modules. This now concludes the first section of Module 1. Depending on the topic of a module and the complexity of each, we will have multiple sections. There could be 4 or 5 sections in a module. There could be 15 or 20. So this is the end of the very first section that we will have done in Module 1. We like to keep the recordings not brief, but in digestible, reasonable bites. So we're going to terminate here. And when we come back, pick up on the analysis of import business models, the different ways that companies import goods into the United States. Please come back soon.